I freed her from a cage, and now she tells the entire galaxy I'm hers. And GT, that's right. She had been in that cage for 3 years. 3 years in the dark, in the cold, fed scraps by creatures who thought she was nothing, and the moment I cut the lock open, she looked up at me with those silver eyes and said 7 words that changed my entire life. She said, "You belong to me now, human." I didn't understand what those words meant. That night I thought she was delirious, maybe broken, maybe something had snapped inside her after years of captivity, but she wasn't broken, not even close. What she was royalty. What she was the single most politically important being in 4-star systems. And I, Marcus Chen, former UNSC combat engineer, part-time salvage contractor, full-time idiot, had just cut her loose from a vault detention cage on an unlicensed mining rig at the edge of known space. By the time the sun came up on that station, every major species in the Concord was going to know my name, not because I was a hero, because she told them I was hers. This is how it happened, all of it, from the moment I heard a sound I shouldn't have heard to the moment I stood in front of the Cathar High Council with the entire galaxy watching and had to decide whether I was going to run from the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to me or finally stop being afraid of it. It started because of a screwdriver. Specifically, it started because I dropped a screwdriver into the lower maintenance shaft of the freighter Calliope Dawn at approximately 200 hours station time, and when I climbed down into that dark, greasy corridor to find it, I heard something I was not supposed to hear, a sound, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, but not quite, more like something between a purr and a chant, barely audible under the hum of the ship's recycling systems. I froze. The Calliope Dawn was supposed to be a dead ship, a derelict. Captain Dross had bought it at auction 6 months ago for the scrap value of its rift drive couplings, and I had been hired to strip the engine room down to bare metal. There was not supposed to be anything alive on this ship. I found her 40 ft down the maintenance corridor behind a pressure door that had been welded shut from the outside and painted over so well it almost looked like bulkhead. Almost, if the screwdriver hadn't rolled exactly where it did, if I hadn't crouched at exactly the right angle, I never would have seen the seam. I would have stripped that engine room, collected my credits, and gone home. She would have died in there, alone in the dark, 3 years into a cage that nobody even knew existed. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because this part matters. I had no idea who she was. I had never seen a Cathar in person. I knew they existed the way most humans knew, vaguely, academically. The way you know a country exists on the other side of the planet because you saw it on a map once. I knew they were a founding species of the Concord. I knew they had a reputation for being cold, formal, and deeply territorial. What I did not know, what almost nobody outside their own culture fully understood, was what it meant when a Cathar claimed something or someone. I'll get to that, stay with me. I cut the weld with a plasma torch I had in my kit. It took 4 minutes. The door swung open and the smell hit me first. Recycled air, old metal, and something underneath that was almost floral, like crushed petals going stale. And then my torch beam found her. She was sitting cross-legged in the center of the space, which was maybe 8 ft by 8 ft, with a bare metal floor and a single dim emergency strip along the ceiling. She was tall, even sitting she looked tall. Her skin was a deep iridescent gray, scaled along the jaw, the forearms, the collarbone, with bioluminescent patterns running beneath the surface that pulsed, slow and dim, the way a heartbeat looks when someone is just barely holding on. Her hair was white, long, matted. She was wearing the remnants of what had once been formal Kithra diplomatic robes, now filthy, torn, reduced to something barely above rags, and her eyes, when they opened and found my light, were silver, pure, reflective. Silver, like mirrors set inside a face that was trying to remember what it felt like to be looked at. She did not flinch, she did not cry out. She looked at me for a long moment, completely still, and then she spoke. And even through 3 years of dehydration and starvation and whatever psychological damage that kind of isolation does to a person, her voice was steady, clear, like she had been rehearsing this moment. You belong to me now, human. I said, I'm Marcus. I'm a salvage contractor. Are you hurt? She said, you freed me. Under Kithra law, I am obligated to protect you for the rest of your natural life. This is not negotiable. My name is Velshira of the 7th house, and you are mine. I said, okay. Can you walk? She said. Yes. Then she stood up, unfolded to her full height of about 64, took one step forward on legs that had been cramped for who knows how long, and collapsed directly into my arms. Here is the part of the story where a smarter man would have called the conquered authorities, filed a report, handed her over to the proper channels, and gone back to stripping copper wire. And for about 30 seconds, standing there in that corridor with an unconscious alien noblewoman draped across my arms, I genuinely considered it. Then I checked her vitals on my scanner, and the scanner told me she was severely malnourished, dangerously dehydrated, and had 3 partially healed fractures in her left arm that had never been properly set, and something in me just decided. I carried her out, not to the authorities, to my bunk on the Calliope Dawn, which I had technically been using as my workshop. I moved the tools, I put her down, I gave her water and what protein supplements I had, and I sat on the floor next to the bunk and waited for her to wake up. She woke up 6 hours later. By that point, I had done some research, not much. The ship's database wasn't exactly comprehensive, but enough to start understanding what I had stumbled into. Velshira of the 7th house wasn't just a diplomat. The 7th house of the Kithra wasn't just a noble family. It was one of 3 founding lineages of the entire Kithra nation structure, which meant she was roughly equivalent, in human terms, to finding a direct descendant of one of the original signatories of Earth's founding charter, locked in a cage on a derelict freighter in the middle of nowhere. The Voth Collective, if you don't know them, and you should, are the reason the Outer Rim has a reputation for lawlessness. They're not a government exactly, more of a federation of interests, and their interests tend to involve acquiring things that don't belong to them. Resources, ships, people. Apparently 3 years ago, a Kithra diplomatic vessel had been lost in transit near Voth-controlled space. The official story from the Voth was that it had suffered a navigation failure and broken up on re-entry over an uninhabited moon. Everyone believed them. There had been a state funeral. Her family had mourned. The conquered had filed a protest note and moved on. She hadn't died in a navigation failure. She had been taken quietly, deliberately, and kept. I was starting to understand, not for ransom, because no ransom demand had ever been made, but as leverage, a pressure point, a card to be played at some future moment in a game the Voth had been playing for decades with the Kithra over territorial rights in the outer reach. When she woke up and I told her what I had found, she was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone who is surprised, the quiet of someone who has just had a theory confirmed that they already knew was true and had spent 3 years sitting with. Then she looked at me and said, "How much do you know about Kithra bonding?" "Law," I said. "Nothing." She said, "Then I will explain at once clearly, and you will not interrupt." She sat up, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and told me everything under Kithra law. And this is law that predates their spacefaring age by roughly 2,000 years. There is a concept called Velkith. It doesn't translate perfectly into any human language, but the closest equivalent would be something like a sacred debt of life. The principle is this: if someone frees you from captivity, from a state of powerlessness, from what the Kithra call the voiceless dark, they have done something that cannot be repaid in currency or service or time. The only appropriate response, the only response that the Kithra consider to be sufficient, is to place yourself in a position of equivalent vulnerability to theirs, to give them the same power over your life that they had when they chose to free you. In practice, in modern Kithra society, Velkith most commonly manifests as a lifelong obligation of protection. The person who freed you becomes what they call a bound one, and a bound one cannot be harmed by any Kithra, cannot be threatened by any agent of the Kithra nation, and falls under the personal protection of whoever they freed. If you freed someone of the 7th house, which I had, your bound status extended across the entire 7th house lineage and every alliance sworn to it. I sat there and listened to all of this and said, "So, when you said I belong to you fight Bibin," she said, "I was stating a fact of law. You freed me. I claim you not as property, as a ward, as someone I am now obligated by everything sacred in my culture to defend with my life." I said, "What happens if I don't want to be claimed?" She looked at me with those silver eyes and said very calmly, "Nothing in Kithra law addresses that possibility. It has never occurred to us that someone would refuse." She paused. "Would you like to be the first?" Modathul thought many men. I did not have a good answer for that. Here is where it gets complicated, because the Velkith bond, the claiming, is not something you do privately. It's not something you whisper in a corridor and keep between the two of you. The moment Velshara said those words to me, by Kithra law and custom, she had initiated a formal declaration, and formal declarations of Velkith are, by tradition, announced publicly within 72 hours of the initial claiming. The claimant is required to register the bond with the Kithra High Council, state the name and identity of the bound one, and formally invoke their protection, which meant that within 72 hours the entire Kithra nation, and through them the entire Concord, was going to learn that Velshara of the 7th house, who had been dead for 3 years, was alive, and that she had bonded herself to a human named Marcus Chen. I found this out approximately 40 minutes after she woke up. I had about 48 hours left before the clock expired. I used approximately 2 of them to sit on the floor of the bunk room and stare at the ceiling and think about how completely my life had changed while I was looking for a screwdriver. We had a problem beyond the diplomatic one, which was that we were still on the Calliope Dawn, which was still technically Captain Dross's property, which was currently docked at Way Station Coral, which was a mid-rim trading post with no conquered presence and a known tolerance for Voth commercial interests. The moment anyone on that station found out who Velshara was, she was going back in a cage, and I was going into something worse. She was weak, still dehydrated, still moving. Like every step cost her something, but she was sharp, sharper than anyone I had ever met, and I had met some extraordinarily sharp people. While I had been staring at the moving ceiling, she had been quietly inventorying everything in the room that could be used as a tool, a weapon, or a bargaining chip. She had cataloged it, ranked it by utility, and when I finally pulled myself together and said, "We need a plan," she already had one. I needed to get to the station's communications relay without being seen, and I needed to send a message, not to the conquered, not to the authorities, to the Kithra House of Seven's nearest diplomatic office, which was at a station called Meridian Post, about 16 hours away at standard rift speed. Message would be simple: she was alive. She was here, and she had invoked Vel Keth. Then I needed to get us off the Calliope Dawn and onto something faster before the Voth figured out where she was. The communications relay on Coral was in a maintenance annex that I had legitimate access to as a contractor, and I sent the message in under 8 minutes. Getting back to the ship was where things went wrong. Captain Dross found me on my way back. Dross was a practical man, not a bad man exactly. I had worked for him 3 times before, and he had always paid clean and on time, but he was practical in the way that people who operate in the outer rim have to be practical, which means when something expensive walks onto his ship, he notices. He had noticed Velshara 6 hours earlier when she had briefly appeared in the corridor, and he had spent those 6 hours making inquiries. By the time he found me, he knew who she was, not everything, but enough. He said very quietly that he needed to speak with me privately about a cargo manifest discrepancy, and the 2 vote security contractors standing behind him told me everything I needed to know about the nature of that discrepancy. I want to tell you that what happened next was tactical, calculated, a product of my military training and quick thinking under pressure. That is partially true. What is also true is that I was scared, not for myself, or not mostly for myself. I was scared for her. I had seen her in that cage. I had seen the fractures in her arm that nobody had bothered to set properly. I had seen what 3 years in the voiceless dark had done to someone who should have been untouchable, who should have had every protection in the galaxy, and I was not going to let them put her back. I said very calmly, "Captain Dross, I need you to think very carefully about what you're about to do." He said, "Marcus." I said, "She's already sent the message. The 7th house already knows she's alive. In about 14 hours, there is going to be a Kethrai rapid response vessel sitting on top of this station, and every person on this way station is going to have a very simple choice about which side of this they want to be on. I'm suggesting to you respectfully that the side with the Kethrai High Council and the full Backing of the Concord founding charter. Is the better side. There was a station. There was a full long silence. Dross looked at the Voth contractors. The Voth contractors looked at each other. One of them reached for a weapon. I was already moving. I am not going to romanticize this. I am a combat engineer. My training is defensive. Demolition, structural analysis under fire and close quarters extraction. I am not a soldier in the traditional sense, but 7 years in the UNSC taught me that the difference between a soldier and a combat engineer is mostly paperwork. I dropped the first contractor in about 4 seconds with a wrench I had in my belt, an actual wrench, not a metaphorical one. The second one had his weapon up by then, and I caught the discharge on my left forearm at an angle that burned through the jacket and scorched the skin underneath but didn't penetrate. What ended the fight wasn't me. Velshara stepped out of the corridor. Behind Dross, she was wearing my spare work jacket, which was about 4 sizes too small. She was barefoot. Her bioluminescent patterns were burning bright now, full intensity, deep blue-white light running under her scales in waves, and she was holding the plasma torch I had left in the bunk room, and she was looking at the second contractor with an expression that I can only describe as the face of someone who has been waiting a very long time to look at someone exactly like this. She said in perfect standard, I am Velshara Kithra, emissary of the 7th House, and I am invoking Article 9 of the Concord founding charter. You will stand down or I will burn this corridor to the walls. The contractor stood down. The Kithra vessel arrived in 11 hours, not 14. They had apparently been moving toward Carroll since before my message, because, as I would later learn, the disappearance of Velshara had never fully closed as an investigation within the 7th House. Her mother, Velkara, the current matriarch, had quietly been funding investigators for 3 years. My message had landed on the desk of someone who had been waiting for exactly that message, and they had mobilized within minutes. The vessel was called the Kethsalis, and it was large enough that when it dropped out of Rift space and positioned itself over Way Station Coral, the station's population of about 4,000 people could see it from every external viewport. It was not subtle. I think it was designed to be not subtle. When a Kithra rapid response vessel sits over your station like a second moon, the conversation about which side you want to be on tends to resolve itself quickly. Velshra transmitted the formal Velketh registration from Dross's communications room, with me standing next to her, both of us slightly singed, both of us slightly in shock, the remnants of the corridor situation still very present in the air behind us. Registration went to the High Council in real-time, open channel, which meant it wasn't just the council that heard it. The Open Concord relay carries broadcast to every station in range, which from Coral was about 40 systems. She said my name. She said it formally, with the full Kithra bonding declaration, all 12 lines of it in the old language first and then in standard. So there was no ambiguity. She said, Marcus Chen, human, salvage contractor, 3rd District of New Shanghai, Earth. Sol system is my bound one. He is claimed, he is mine. Let every house and every nation and every power that has ever bent the knee to the principles of the conquered hear this and know, any hand raised against him is raised against me. And then she looked at me and said, quietly just for me. I know you did not ask for this. I am sorry that I cannot give you the choice. I am not sorry that you are alive. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing, but I didn't move away from her. The Vath Collective's response came within 2 hours. It was exactly what you would expect from a power that had just been caught holding a Kithra noble in a hidden cage for 3 years. Denial, outrage, accusations of fabrication, threats of trade sanctions. Concord's response came within 4 hours. A formal demand for explanation, recall of the Vath ambassador, and the opening of an emergency session of the Concord Assembly. The Kithra High Council's response came within 6 hours. It was a single line broadcast on every major relay in the Concord. It said, "We are coming for our daughter, and we are bringing the full weight of the 7th House and all sworn allies to lay at the feet of the human who brought her home." I read that line on a borrowed data pad, sitting in the medical bay of the Quetzales while a Kithra physician repaired the burn on my forearm. Velshara was in the next bay getting properly treated for the first time in 3 years. I could hear the low hum of her voice through the wall. She was already talking to her mother via comm, already reconstructing 3 years of missed intelligence, already impossibly back to being who she was. The physician finished with my arm and looked at me with the same calm silver eyes that all Kithra seemed to have and said, "The matriarch will want to meet you." I said, "Is that something I should be worried about?" The physician considered this for a moment and said, "Velshara's mother has waited 3 years to thank whoever brought her daughter back. I believe she intends to be thorough." 3 days later, I was standing in the hall of First Light on Quetzaro, which is the Kithra homeworld, which I had never expected to visit in my life. The hall of First Light is where the Kithra High Council convenes for matters of exceptional significance. The ceiling is open to the sky, which on Quetzaro is a deep purple during the day and completely transparent at night so that you can see the stars. The chamber holds approximately 2,000, and it was full not just with Kithra, with representatives from every conquered member species, because this session was public and because what was happening here had implications that went far beyond me and Velshara and a cage on a derelict freighter. The Volt Collective had just formally been charged with the kidnapping and unlawful detention of a conquered emissary. The evidence once presented was overwhelming. Velshara had spent 3 years quietly memorizing everything she could observe from her cage, the faces of guards, the patterns of supply runs, the serial numbers she could see stamped on equipment through the crack under the door. She had a perfect photographic memory, and she had used every hour of those 3 years to build a case. The moment she was free and had access to a recorder, she had already begun dictating it, but that wasn't what I was there for. I was there because of the Velkith Declaration, because in Kithra tradition, a formal claiming before the High Council requires the bound one to speak, not to agree, not to accept, but to be heard, to say who they are, to stand in front of the people whose laws had just rewritten their life and have a voice in what happened next. Velshara stood beside me. She was back in formal robes, now deep black with silver, bioluminescent threading that moved with her own patterns, and she was tall and composed and completely, absolutely herself in a way that made something in my chest ache a little, because I had Seen her not 3 days ago, crumpled on a floor, and now she was standing here. Like the cage had never had any hold on her at all. I knew better, but the galaxy didn't need to know better. The galaxy needed to see what she was showing them. She introduced me, spoke my name into the most significant political chamber I had ever been within 100 miles of. And then the matriarch Velkara, who was taller than her daughter by several inches and who had the kind of presence that made the air in a room rearrange itself, looked at me with eyes the same silver as her daughter's and said, "Marcus Chen, speak." And GT, laughter. And GT, I had prepared something reasonable and diplomatic and appropriately humble, something that acknowledged the honor and expressed gratitude for the protection of the seventh house and navigated the political complexity with the kind of careful language that a situation like this deserved. I didn't say any of that. And GT, laughter. And GT, I said, I found her because I dropped a screwdriver. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what Velkath meant, and I didn't know what I was walking into. I knew she was in a cage she shouldn't have been in. I knew she was hurt, and I knew the people who put her there had painted over the door so well that if I hadn't crouched at exactly the right angle at exactly the right moment, nobody ever would have found her. I paused. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a soldier anymore. I strip old ships for parts and I fix things that are broken. I don't know what happens next in terms of treaties or sanctions or whatever the conquered does with the Voth. I'll leave that to people who understand it. Another pause. What I know is that she told me I belong to her, and I've had 3 days to think about whether that's something I'm willing to argue with. I've decided it's not. There was a silence in the hall of first light that I think lasted about 4 seconds but felt considerably longer, and then Velkara, the matriarch of the 7th house, looked at her daughter, and Velshara, who had been unreadable, composed, perfectly formal since the moment we entered the chamber, smiled, just for a second, just enough. The matriarch said, "The claim is affirmed, the bond is registered. Marcus Chen stands under the protection of the 7th house from this day." She looked back at me with those silver mirror eyes and said, "Welcome to the family, human. Try not to drop anything important." That was 2 years ago. Voth Collective lost 4 trade corridor agreements and 2 seats on the Concord Assembly. Velshar is back in her role as emissary, more powerful now than before because surviving what she survived and doing what she did with the evidence she spent 3 years building is the kind of thing that reshapes a political landscape. I still do salvage work. I'm better funded now for reasons that probably don't need explanation. I still carry a plasma torch. I never did find that screwdriver. If you're watching this and you think that the universe is indifferent, that your choices don't land, that the moment you make a decision in the dark when nobody's watching doesn't matter, I'm here to tell you that one of those moments changed everything for me. I was tired. I was behind on a contract, and I crouched down to pick up a tool and heard a sound, and I went toward it instead of away from it. That's the whole story. Everything else is just what happened because of that.